The snow had been falling for 3 days straight when Jake Morrison finally turned off the main highway onto the narrow forest road. His pickup truck's headlights cut through the swirling white, illuminating pine trees so heavily laden with snow they looked like something from a Christmas card. In the passenger seat, his golden retriever, Scout, pressed his nose against the window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the winter wilderness pass by. This is the story of a veteran and his dog who spent Christmas in a forest cabin and discovered something behind a tree that would change not just their lives, but the lives of an entire community. It's a tale of hidden history, unexpected connections, and the kind of Christmas miracle that only seems impossible until it happens. If you're ready for this incredible journey that will warm your heart and restore your faith in humanity, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another amazing story like this one. Jake had rented the cabin on a whim, really. December 20th had rolled around, and he'd realized he had nowhere to go for Christmas. No family left after his parents died in a car accident while he was deployed in Iraq. No close friends who weren't already wrapped up in their own family celebrations. Just him and Scout in their small apartment in Seattle, facing another holiday season that reminded him of everything he'd lost. The cabin had appeared in an online listing like a sign. Secluded forest retreat, perfect for a quiet Christmas, dog-friendly. The photos showed a rustic log cabin nestled among towering pines in the Cascade Mountains, complete with a stone fireplace and a view of a frozen lake. The owner, listed only as M. Wheeler, had accepted his booking immediately and left the key in a lockbox with minimal communication. The road grew narrower as Jake drove deeper into the forest. The GPS had given up 10 miles back, but M. Wheeler's hand-drawn map was surprisingly accurate. "Turn left at the lightning-struck pine," it read. "Follow the creek for 2 miles. Cabin is in the clearing on your right." Scout whined softly, sensing they were close to their destination. The dog had been Jake's constant companion for 6 years now, trained as a service animal to help with his PTSD, but serving more as the only family he had left. Scout had an uncanny ability to sense Jake's anxiety attacks before they happened, to ground him when memories of Fallujah threatened to overwhelm him. The cabin appeared suddenly, materializing from the snowstorm like something from a fairy tale. It was bigger than Jake had expected, a 2-story log structure with a steep roof designed to shed snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, which surprised him. Had M. Wheeler come to light a fire for his arrival? Jake parked the truck and sat for a moment, gathering himself. New places always made him nervous, a holdover from Iraq where every unfamiliar building could hide danger. Scout sensed his hesitation and licked his hand, a gentle reminder that they were safe. "All right, boy," Jake said, grabbing his duffel bag and the supplies he'd brought. "Let's see what we've gotten ourselves into." The cabin's front door was made of thick oak with iron hinges that looked hand-forged. Inside, Jake found himself in a living room that belonged in another century. The walls were covered in old photographs and paintings of the forest. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes and yellowed paperbacks. The furniture was all handmade, carved from local wood with obvious skill and care. But it was the Christmas tree that stopped Jake in his tracks. It stood in the corner by the window, at least 8 feet tall and decorated with ornaments that looked antique. Glass baubles reflected the fire's light, and carved wooden figures hung from the branches. At the top sat not a star or angel, but a small wooden lighthouse, painted in meticulous detail. Scout immediately went to investigate the tree. Sniffing around its base with intense interest, he pawed at something behind it, whining in a way Jake had never heard before. "What is it, boy?" Jake asked, moving closer. Behind the tree, partially hidden by the branches and presents that someone had placed there, was a door. Not a regular door, but a small one, maybe 4 feet high, built into the wall so seamlessly Jake wouldn't have noticed it without Scout's help. The door had no handle, just a keyhole, and what looked like words carved into the wood. Jake pushed the tree aside carefully, not wanting to disturb the decorations, and knelt to read the inscription, "For those who served when the time is right." A chill ran down Jake's spine that had nothing to do with the winter cold. He stood up, backing away from the door. This was starting to feel like a setup, like someone had lured him here specifically. His military instincts kicked in, scanning for threats, exit routes, potential weapons. Scout, however, seemed completely at ease. The dog sat by the small door, tail wagging, looking at Jake expectantly. In their years together, Scout had never steered him wrong. If the dog sensed danger, he would show it. Jake forced himself to calm down, using the breathing exercises his VA therapist had taught him. He was being paranoid. M. Wheeler probably didn't even know he was a veteran. It was just a coincidence. But as he unpacked his things, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be here. The cabin felt familiar somehow, though he was certain he'd never been in this part of the Cascades before. The photographs on the walls showed the forest through different seasons and years, some clearly decades old. In several of them, he could see figures, but the old photography made their faces unclear. That first night, Jake built up the fire and cooked a simple dinner on the old gas stove. Scout curled up on a thick rug in front of the fireplace, completely at home. Jake tried to read one of the books from the shelf, a collection of local history, but his eyes kept drifting to the small door behind the Christmas tree. He slept fitfully, dreams mixing with memories, faces of soldiers he'd served with, friends who hadn't made it home, his parents waving goodbye as he shipped out for his third tour, and strangely, a recurring image of a lighthouse standing firm against crashing waves. Jake woke to Scout's urgent barking. It was still dark, but the dog was at the cabin's main door, hackles raised. Jake grabbed the pistol he always kept close, another habit from Iraq, and peered out the window. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. They weren't moving toward the cabin, just standing there, watching. "Who's there?" Jake called out, cracking the door open. Scout tried to push past him, but Jake held the dog back. The figure raised a hand in what might have been a greeting, then turned and walked back into the forest. Jake watched until they disappeared among the trees, his heart racing. Should he call the police? But what would he say? Someone stood near his cabin and then left. He spent the rest of the night awake, sitting in a chair facing the door with Scout at his feet. When dawn finally broke, painting the snow-covered forest in shades of pink and gold, Jake ventured outside to investigate. He found footprints in the snow, leading from the forest to the spot where the figure had stood, then back again. But there was something else too, a package wrapped in oilcloth hanging from a tree branch. Jake retrieved it carefully, checking for wires or anything suspicious. Inside the oilcloth was a leather journal, old and weather-beaten. The first page had a note written in shaky handwriting. "Sergeant Morrison, I knew you would come. I've been waiting. The cabin has been waiting. Open the door on Christmas Eve, not before. Use the key your dog will find. Read this journal. Understand why." A friend you never met. Jake's blood ran cold. Whoever wrote this knew his name, his rank. This wasn't random. He'd been specifically chosen, targeted. His first instinct was to pack up and leave immediately. But something made him hesitate. Maybe it was Scout's calm demeanor, or maybe it was the word friend in the note, but Jake found himself opening the journal instead of running. The first entry was dated December 24th, 1971. "My name is Michael Wheeler. I'm 23 years old, and I've just come home from Vietnam, missing my left arm and most of my faith in humanity. My grandfather left me this cabin, and I've come here to hide from the world. Maybe to die, if I'm honest. But something strange has happened. I found a door behind the Christmas tree, a door that wasn't there when I was a child visiting Grandpa. Inside, well, inside changes everything." Jake sank into a chair, the journal trembling in his hands. Michael Wheeler, M. Wheeler, the cabin's owner. Another veteran from another war, who had found the same door Scout had discovered. The journal entries painted a picture of a man destroyed by war, slowly finding healing in the solitude of the forest. But December 24th, 1972, exactly 1 year after his first Christmas in the cabin, something had changed. "I opened the door again tonight. The room behind it. I can't explain it rationally. It's not possible for it to exist. The cabin isn't big enough, but it's there. And inside the letters are still there, hundreds of them. Letters from soldiers who never made it home, somehow gathered in this impossible room. Last words to loved ones, never sent. I spent the night reading them, crying for men I never knew. But in the morning I knew what I had to do." Jake looked up from the journal. Letters from soldiers, an impossible room. It sounded like the delusions of a traumatized mind, except Scout had found the door. Jake had seen it himself. The journal continued, describing how Michael Wheeler had spent the next years tracking down the families of the soldiers whose letters he'd found. He'd delivered messages decades after they were written, brought closure to families who had never known their loved ones' final thoughts. It had become his mission, his purpose, his path back to humanity. But the entries grew more mysterious as they went on. Wheeler wrote about other veterans finding their way to the cabin, always around Christmas, always when they needed it most. He wrote about the door only opening for those who had served, only when they were ready to see what was inside. He wrote about healing that couldn't be explained, connections that shouldn't exist, and a purpose that transcended understanding. The final entry was dated just a week ago. "I'm 93 now, and this will be my last Christmas." But the cabin's work isn't done. Sergeant Jake Morrison will arrive on December 20th. He'll be scared, suspicious, probably armed. He'll have a golden retriever named Scout, who will understand before he does. Jake lost his parents while he was deployed. He thinks he has no family left. He's wrong. The door will show him. The letters will guide him. And maybe, if I've timed this right, he'll understand that some inheritances are more than property. Some missions don't end with discharge papers, and some families are connected by something stronger than blood. Jake set down the journal, his hands shaking. How could Wheeler have known about his parents, about Scout? How could any of this be real? Scout padded over and rested his head on Jake's lap, brown eyes full of that uncanny wisdom dogs sometimes possessed. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the forest in pristine white. December 21st. 3 days until Christmas Eve. Jake spent those 3 days reading every entry in the journal, exploring the cabin, and trying to make sense of what was happening. He found more photographs, and in some of the recent ones he could make out Michael Wheeler, an elderly man with kind eyes and a prosthetic arm, always with a dog by his side. Different dogs over the years, but always the same type of loyal companion. He found records too, carefully maintained files of letters delivered, families reunited with last words they'd never expected to receive. There were newspaper clippings, thank you notes, photographs of tearful reunions. Wheeler had turned his pain into purpose, his trauma into a mission of healing. On December 23rd, Jake discovered another journal, this one dating back to World War I. It was written by Wheeler's grandfather, describing how he'd found the door after returning from France in 1919. The entries were remarkably similar: an impossible room, letters from fallen soldiers, a compulsion to deliver them. There were more journals going back further. The cabin itself had been built in 1887 by a Civil War veteran named James Morrison. Jake's heart skipped when he read the name. Morrison, his own family name. But that had to be coincidence. Morrison was a common enough name. But as he dug deeper into the records Wheeler had kept, Jake found a genealogy chart. James Morrison had a son who moved to Oregon. That son had a son who moved to Seattle. That man had been Jake's great-grandfather. The cabin wasn't just random. It was family. Family he'd never known about, a legacy hidden for over a century. That night, Jake sat by the fire with Scout, wrestling with disbelief and wonder in equal measure. The rational part of his mind, the part trained by the military to assess and analyze, said this was impossible. Doors didn't appear behind Christmas trees. Rooms couldn't exist that defied physical space. Letters from dead soldiers didn't mysteriously gather in hidden chambers. But the evidence was overwhelming. The journals, the records, the photographs, the genealogy. And underneath it all, a feeling in his gut that soldiers learned to trust, the feeling that something was true even when it couldn't be explained. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Jake had spent the morning chopping wood, needing the physical activity to calm his nerves. Scout stayed close, seeming to sense the importance of the day. As afternoon faded to evening, Jake could no longer postpone the inevitable. He moved the Christmas tree carefully, fully exposing the small door. Scout immediately went to a specific spot on the floor and began pawing at a loose floorboard. Underneath was a small brass key, old and tarnished but solid. "How did you know?" Jake asked the dog, who simply wagged his tail in response. The key fit perfectly in the lock. Jake turned it slowly, hearing mechanisms click and shift within the door. With a deep breath, he pulled it open. The room beyond shouldn't have existed. The cabin's exterior wall was directly behind where the door was, leaving no space for anything larger than a closet. But Jake found himself looking into a room at least 20 feet deep and equally wide. The walls were lined with shelves, and the shelves were filled with letters, thousands of them organized by war and year. Jake stepped inside, Scout following. The air was different here, charged somehow, like the moment before lightning strikes. He approached the nearest shelf, labeled Iraq, Afghanistan 2003-2021. His hand trembled as he pulled out a letter at random. It was dated 2 days before he'd left Iraq, written by a specialist he'd known, Rodriguez, who'd been killed by an IED 3 weeks after Jake's tour ended. The letter was to his daughter, telling her he loved her, that he was proud of her, that she should take care of her mother. It had never been sent. Jake sank to his knees, overwhelmed. He pulled out more letters, recognizing name after name. Men and women he'd served with, some he'd known well, others only in passing. All gone, all with final words that had never reached their destinations. But there was more. In a section marked Connections, Jake found files that seemed impossible. Photos of children and grandchildren of soldiers, people whose lives had been shaped by losses they carried. And among them, a file with his own name. Inside were documents he'd never seen. Letters his father had written to him while he was deployed. Letters that had never been sent because his parents had died before they could mail them. His father's words, full of pride and love and worry, broke the dam Jake had built around his grief. He sobbed, clutching the letters, feeling Scout's warm presence beside him. If this story is touching your heart, the way these letters touched Jake's, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share these incredible stories that remind us all of the connections that bind us together, especially during the holiday season. But the letters from his parents were just the beginning. There was more in his file, a family tree he'd never seen, showing connections to other military families going back generations. And at the bottom, a note in Michael Wheeler's handwriting. Jake, your great-great-grandfather James Morrison built this cabin after the Civil War. He discovered what you've now found, that some places become conduits for healing, that some families are called to serve not just in war, but in its aftermath. The Morrisons and the Wheelers have been connected through this cabin for over a century, taking turns as guardians of these letters, these last words, these connections. Your parents knew about the cabin. They were planning to tell you when you came home. They had written you a letter explaining everything, but they died before they could send it. That letter is here, waiting for you. But there's more. The room shows not just the past, but the present. Look for the section marked Living Connections. You're not as alone as you think. Jake found the section Wheeler had mentioned. It contained files on living veterans, men and women struggling with the same isolation and pain Jake knew so well. But more than that, it showed connections, people related to each other through military service who didn't know of each other's existence. Brothers and sisters in arms whose actual brothers and sisters had served in different wars. Children of soldiers who had saved each other's lives, never knowing their connection. And in his own file, Jake found something that stopped his breath. A photograph of a woman his age, labeled Sarah Chen. The notes explained she was the daughter of Master Sergeant David Chen, who had saved Jake's father's life in the First Gulf War. Jake's father had tried to find Chen's family for years to thank them, but had lost track of them. Sarah Chen was now a trauma counselor in Portland, specializing in helping veterans. She was also, according to the notes, spending Christmas alone. Jake sat in the impossible room for hours, reading letters, understanding the scope of what Wheeler had discovered and protected. This wasn't just about delivering old letters. It was about connections, about showing veterans they weren't alone, about weaving together the threads of service and sacrifice that connected so many American families. As midnight approached on Christmas Eve, something changed in the room. The letters began to glow faintly, and new ones appeared on the shelves. Current letters, Jake realized, letters being written right now by deployed soldiers, somehow copies appearing here in this impossible space. The magic, if that's what it was, wasn't finished. It was ongoing, alive, waiting for someone to continue the work. Jake understood now what Wheeler had meant. This wasn't just an inheritance of property. It was a mission, a purpose, a calling. Deliver the letters, make the connections, help the families find each other, show veterans they weren't alone. He gathered the letters from his parents, Rodriguez's letter to his daughter, and several others from soldiers he'd known personally. Tomorrow, Christmas Day, he would begin. He had addresses in Wheeler's files, phone numbers, email contacts. It would take time, probably years, to deliver them all. But Jake had nothing but time. As he left the room, the door closing softly behind him, Jake felt something shift inside himself. The weight he'd carried since Iraq, the survivor's guilt, the isolation, it didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Purpose, mission, connection. Scout barked softly, and Jake realized someone was outside. His hand went to his weapon, but Scout's tail was wagging. This wasn't danger. Jake opened the cabin door to find an elderly woman standing in the snow, supported by a walking stick. "You must be Jake," she said, smiling. "I'm Martha Wheeler, Michael's daughter. He told me you'd be here." Jake helped her inside, confused. "I thought the journal said he had no family." Martha laughed, settling into a chair by the fire. "He had no biological children, but Dad adopted many of us over the years, veterans who came to the cabin, people who helped with the letters. We became his family. Now I suppose we're yours too." She'd brought food for Christmas dinner, she explained. Others would arrive tomorrow. It was tradition, she said. Christmas at the cabin for those who had nowhere else to go. Those who understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice, to survive. "Dad wanted me to give you this," Martha said, pulling out an envelope. Inside was a deed to the cabin, already transferred to Jake's name, and a bank account with enough money to maintain the property and continue the work. "He also wanted me to tell you about Sarah Chen. She doesn't know about any of this yet, but her father left letters here too. Dad thought maybe you could be the one to deliver them." Jake looked at the photograph of Sarah Chen again. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her file mentioned she had a golden retriever too, one she'd trained as a therapy dog for her veteran clients. "It's a lot to process," Martha said gently. "Dad didn't expect you to understand it all at once, but he knew you were the right person. Scout knew too, didn't you, boy?" Scout barked in agreement, making Martha laugh. She stood to leave, promising to return tomorrow with others. "Oh, and Jake, the room will show you more when you're ready. This is just the beginning." After Martha left, Jake sat by the fire, his parents' letters in his lap, Scout at his feet. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle and quiet. The Christmas tree lights twinkled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. For the first time in years, Jake didn't feel alone. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear. Jake woke to the smell of coffee already brewing, which should have been impossible since he was alone, but he was learning to accept the impossible. In the kitchen he found a note. "Merry Christmas, Jake. The coffee is from all of us who found our way here before you. Today you join a family you never knew you had, the guardians of the cabin." By noon, people began arriving. Martha returned with her husband, both veterans of Vietnam. A younger couple came next, Marines who'd served in Somalia, then an older man who'd been in Korea, a woman who'd served in Kosovo, a family whose father had just returned from Syria. They all knew about the cabin, about the room, about the letters. They'd all been helped by Michael Wheeler at some point, and they'd all continued his work in their own ways. They prepared Christmas dinner together, sharing stories and memories. Jake learned that the cabin had become a nexus for healing, that veterans found their way here when they needed it most. Some stayed for days, some for years. Michael Wheeler had been the latest in a long line of guardians, and now it was Jake's turn. As they sat down to dinner, Jake felt overwhelmed by the warmth and acceptance. These strangers weren't strangers at all. They were connected by invisible threads of service, sacrifice, and survival. They understood without explanation why he sometimes went quiet, why loud noises made him flinch, why he needed Scout beside him. After dinner, Jake told them about Sarah Chen, about the connection between their fathers. Martha smiled knowingly. "Michael thought you two should meet. He had a gift for seeing connections others missed. Why don't you call her? Invite her for New Year's. The cabin is meant for bringing people together." Jake hesitated, but the others encouraged him. With shaking hands, he dialed the number from her file. She answered on the third ring, her voice warm but tired. "Sarah Chen, my name is Jake Morrison. This is going to sound strange, but I have some letters from your father and a story you need to hear." The conversation that followed was emotional and complicated. Sarah was skeptical at first, then shocked, then tearful as Jake explained about the cabin, about their father's connection, about the letters waiting for her. By the end, she had agreed to drive up from Portland the next day. That night, after everyone had left, Jake returned to the impossible room. New sections had appeared, or perhaps he simply hadn't noticed them before. One was labeled Future Connections, and it contained something extraordinary: photographs and documents of children not yet born, future veterans who would need the cabin's healing, future guardians who would take up the work. Jake understood then that the cabin existed outside normal rules of space and time. It was a place where past, present, and future converged, where connections transcended death, where healing was always possible. It sounded insane, but the evidence was undeniable. He spent the night reading more letters, planning deliveries, understanding the network of helpers Michael Wheeler had built over the decades. There were volunteers across the country, people who helped track down families, who provided support for deliveries, who offered counseling and assistance. The cabin was the heart, but the network was vast. Sarah arrived the next afternoon, cautious but curious. She had the same kind eyes from her photograph, and her golden retriever, Bella, immediately befriended Scout. Jake showed her the letters from her father first, giving her privacy to read them. When she emerged from the cabin an hour later, tears streaming down her face, she understood. "He wrote about your father," she said, "about the life debt he felt he could never repay. He spent years looking for him, wanting to say thank you." She paused, looking at Jake with wonder. "And now here we are, their children, brought together by this impossible place." Jake showed her the room then, watching her face transform from skepticism to awe to understanding. She read letters from other soldiers, saw the connections mapped out in the files, understood the scope of what the cabin represented. "This is why I became a counselor," she said softly, "to help veterans heal. But this is beyond anything I imagined." Over the following days, Sarah stayed at the cabin helping Jake organize the letters, plan deliveries, understand the system Wheeler had built. They worked side by side, their dogs playing together, sharing meals and stories and long conversations by the fire. Jake found himself opening up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone since before his deployment. She understood, not just intellectually, but emotionally, having grown up with a father scarred by war. New Year's Eve found them still at the cabin, now joined by several other veterans who'd come for the holiday. As midnight approached, they stood outside in the snow, looking up at stars brilliant in the clear mountain air. Jake felt a peace he hadn't experienced in years, not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose and connection. "My father would have loved this," Sarah said, her hand finding Jake's in the darkness, knowing that his service, his sacrifice, led to something beautiful. Jake squeezed her hand gently. "Mine, too." As the calendar turned to a new year, Jake understood that his life had fundamentally changed. The cabin had given him a mission, a family, and possibly something more with Sarah. But more than that, it had shown him that the wounds of war could become sources of wisdom, that isolation could transform into connection, that the dead could still speak to the living in ways that mattered. January brought the real work. Jake and Sarah began delivering letters together, starting with those in Washington and Oregon. Each delivery was emotional, often heartbreaking, but also healing. Families who had wondered about last thoughts, final words, messages of love, finally had closure. Rodriguez's daughter, now a teenager, cried when she read her father's letter, then hugged Jake so tightly he could barely breathe. "He talked about you," she said, "in other letters. Said you were the best sergeant he ever had. Said you kept them all as safe as you could." Those words helped ease a guilt Jake had carried for years. He couldn't save everyone, but he'd done his best. And now, through these letters, he could still serve those who had served beside him. The network of helpers grew as word spread carefully, quietly, among veteran communities. The cabin became a pilgrimage site of sorts, though its location was closely guarded. Only those who truly needed it found their way there, often through dreams or coincidences that couldn't quite be explained. Jake discovered that the impossible room changed based on who entered it. Sarah saw connections related to mental health and healing. A Vietnam veteran saw letters from his specific unit. A Gold Star mother found messages from her son she'd never received. The room seemed to know what each person needed. By February, Jake and Sarah had established a routine. They spent weekdays in Portland, where Sarah continued her counseling practice, and Jake began volunteering at the VA hospital. Weekends were spent at the cabin, organizing letters, meeting with other veterans, planning deliveries. Their relationship deepened naturally, two damaged people finding wholeness together. Scout and Bella became inseparable, often curling up together by the cabin's fireplace. Jake joked that the dogs had known before their humans did, that they were meant to be together. But maybe it wasn't really a joke. The cabin had taught him that some connections were deeper than chance. One evening in March, while sorting through a new section of letters that had appeared, Jake found something that stopped him cold. It was a letter in his own handwriting, dated 20 years in the future, addressed to a child named James. His son, the letter said. Sarah's and his son, who would one day need these words when he returned from his own war. Jake showed the letter to Sarah, both of them stunned by the implications. The cabin didn't just preserve the past, it knew the future. They would have a son. He would serve. He would need healing, and the cabin would be waiting for him. It's a cycle, Sarah said softly. Each generation serving, suffering, then finding their way here to heal and help others heal. Is that a burden or a blessing? Jake asked. Both, Sarah replied. Like everything about service, like everything about love. Spring brought new challenges. A development company had bought land adjacent to the cabin's property, planning to build a resort. They didn't know about the impossible room, but any major construction could disturb whatever delicate balance allowed it to exist. Jake found himself fighting a different kind of battle, using Wheeler's money to buy surrounding land, creating a buffer zone of protected forest. The legal fight attracted attention Jake didn't want. Reporters started asking questions about why a disabled veteran was so determined to protect a random patch of forest. Jake had to be careful, selective with the truth. He talked about preserving wilderness, about needing solitude for PTSD recovery, about honoring Michael Wheeler's memory. It's all true, but not the whole truth. Help came from unexpected sources. Veterans across the country, many who had been touched by the letter deliveries without knowing their source, donated to a land preservation fund. Environmental groups, attracted by the conservation angle, provided legal support. The development company, facing mounting pressure and bad publicity for opposing a disabled veteran's sanctuary, eventually withdrew their plans. Summer at the cabin was magical. The forest came alive with birdsong and wildflowers. Jake and Sarah were married in a simple ceremony in the clearing, surrounded by the extended family of veterans and helpers they'd come to love. Scout and Bella wore matching bow ties as ring bearers, to everyone's amusement. Martha Wheeler officiated, having gotten ordained online specifically for the occasion. Michael would be so happy, she said, tears in her eyes. He always said the cabin would know when its next guardians had arrived. Plural. He knew it would take two of you. As Jake and Sarah exchanged vows, promising to love, honor, and continue the work they'd inherited, the impossible room pulsed with warm light visible through the cabin windows. Their friends felt it too, a sense of blessing, of continuity, of something larger than themselves nodding in approval. The wedding gifts were unusual, but perfect. One veteran had compiled a database of military genealogy records to help trace connections. Another had created a secure website for families seeking information about lost letters. A Gold Star mother had started a fund to support travel costs for letter deliveries. The network was formalizing, growing, becoming something that could outlast any individual guardian. But the most extraordinary gift came from the cabin itself. When Jake and Sarah entered the impossible room together as a married couple, they found a new section had appeared, Healing in Progress. It contained not letters but blank journals, thousands of them waiting to be filled. A note in Michael Wheeler's handwriting explained, "The letters connect us to the past. The journals will connect us to the future. Every veteran who comes here should write their story, their truth, their healing. Someday these journals will help others the way the letters help now." The cycle continues. Jake and Sarah understood. They began encouraging every visitor to write, to document their journey from trauma to healing. Some wrote a few pages, others filled volumes. The journals began to create a tapestry of survival, resilience, and recovery that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Fall brought unexpected visitors, a delegation from the Pentagon, having heard rumors of something unusual in the Cascades involving veterans. Jake was terrified they would try to seize the cabin, classify it, turn it into some kind of government project. But Sarah had a better read on them. "They're not here as officials," she said, studying the lead visitor, a general with kind eyes and a slight limp. "They're here as veterans." She was right. General Patricia Hayes had lost her son in Afghanistan. She'd heard through the network about letters being delivered, about a place where healing happened. She wasn't there to investigate but to understand. maybe to find peace herself. Jake made a decision that would have seemed impossible months earlier. He showed her the room. The general, a woman who had commanded thousands and seen the worst of war, stood in silent awe as she read letters from soldiers she'd known, as she found the section containing her son's last words. "This is impossible," she said finally, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Yes," Jake agreed, "and it's also real." General Hayes became a protector, using her influence to ensure the cabin remained undisturbed. She classified it as a site of special historical significance without revealing why, creating official protection without official scrutiny. She also began quietly directing veterans who needed help toward the Pacific Northwest, knowing some would find their way to the cabin. As winter approached again, Jake reflected on the year that had passed. He'd arrived at the cabin broken and alone, planning to spend a solitary Christmas in hiding. Instead, he'd found purpose, family, love, and a mission that gave meaning to his survival. The impossibility of it all had stopped bothering him. Some gifts were too precious to question. December brought the first major snow and with it new arrivals. A female Marine who'd lost her unit to an IED. A Navy corpsman struggling with memories of those he couldn't save. An Air Force pilot who'd been shot down and spent months as a POW. They all found their way to the cabin, drawn by dreams or suggestions or coincidences that weren't really coincidences. Jake and Sarah welcomed them all, showing them the room when they were ready, helping them find the letters or connections or journals they needed. Some stayed for days, others just for an afternoon. All left changed in some way, carrying a piece of the cabin's magic back into the world. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Jake had first opened the impossible door, something extraordinary happened. Michael Wheeler appeared in the room, not as a ghost or a vision, but as something else, something the room made possible. He was young again, wearing his Vietnam-era uniform, his arm restored. He smiled at Jake and Sarah, nodding his approval. "You've done well," he said, his voice carrying across impossible distances. "Better than I hoped. The cabin has accepted you fully now." "How is this possible?" Jake asked, though he'd learned to stop expecting rational answers. "The room exists where all times meet," Wheeler explained. "Past, present, future, all converging in service and sacrifice. I'm speaking to you from 1972, but also from 2023, but also from beyond both. Time doesn't work here the way it does outside." He showed them things they hadn't discovered yet. Hidden compartments containing letters from the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, wars that hadn't happened yet. He explained that the cabin had always existed in some form, sometimes physical, sometimes not, appearing when and where it was needed most. "But why us?" Sarah asked. "Why this place?" "Because someone has to guard the connections," Wheeler said. "Someone has to ensure the letters find their homes, the families find each other, the veterans find healing. It's always been someone going back further than you can imagine. Now it's you." He began to fade, but not before offering one last piece of wisdom. "The room will show you what you need to see when you need to see it. Trust it. Trust each other. And remember, every person who comes here is family." As Wheeler disappeared, the room pulsed with warm light, and new sections revealed themselves. Letters from wars across the world. Not just American soldiers, but all warriors who had served and sacrificed. The cabin's mission was expanding, its reach growing beyond national boundaries. Christmas Day brought the largest gathering yet. Veterans from every conflict since World War II, families of the fallen, helpers and healers, all converging on the cabin. They shared meals, stories, tears, and laughter. Jake watched it all from the porch, Sarah beside him, Scout and Bella at their feet, marveling at what had grown from his lonely Christmas plan a year ago. "Next Christmas," Sarah said quietly, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, "we'll have another guardian in training." Jake looked at her in wonder, then at the cabin, then at the gathered family of choice around them. The letter to their future son James suddenly made sense. The cycle would continue. As the sun set on Christmas Day, painting the snow-covered forest in shades of gold and pink, Jake understood that he had received the greatest gift possible. Not just healing from his own wounds, but the ability to help others heal. Not just finding family, but creating family for those who had none. Not just discovering purpose, but inheriting a purpose that transcended individual life. The cabin stood solid and warm against the winter night, smoke curling from its chimney, light spilling from its windows. Inside, the impossible room waited, full of letters and connections and healing yet to come. Outside, the forest kept its ancient watch, protecting this sacred space where veterans could find what they'd lost in war: hope, connection, purpose, and peace. Jake Morrison had come to the forest cabin expecting to spend a lonely Christmas hiding from the world. Instead, he'd discovered that sometimes the best hiding places are where we find ourselves. The deepest loneliness is where we discover connection, and the most impossible things are the ones most worth believing in. The following spring brought new challenges and revelations. Sarah's pregnancy progressed smoothly, but the ultrasound revealed twins, James and Jennifer. The letter Jake had found addressed to James would have a companion, though Jennifer's letter hadn't appeared yet. The room, it seemed, revealed things in its own time. More veterans found their way to the cabin, each bringing their own story of trauma and resilience. Jake and Sarah developed a system, creating a structured program that combined the mystical elements of the room with practical therapy and peer support. Sarah's training as a counselor proved invaluable, while Jake's military experience helped him connect with veterans who might have rejected traditional therapy. One visitor particularly stood out: Marcus Thompson, a young Army specialist who'd lost both legs to an IED just 6 months earlier. He arrived angry, suicidal, convinced his life was over. Scout and Bella seemed to sense his special need, rarely leaving his side during his first days at the cabin. Jake didn't push Marcus to see the room immediately. Instead, he worked with him on practical things, adjusting to prosthetics, adapting daily tasks, finding new ways to define strength. It was only after a week that Marcus was ready to see the impossible door. What Marcus found in the room changed him profoundly. Not just letters from fallen comrades, but a vision of his future, himself, years later, competing in Paralympic events, teaching other amputees to ski, living a full and meaningful life. The room didn't usually show individual futures so clearly, but sometimes Jake had learned it knew exactly what someone needed to see. Marcus stayed at the cabin for 3 months, becoming part of the informal staff. He helped with renovations, making the cabin more accessible for disabled veterans. He started a workshop in one of the outbuildings, teaching woodworking to other visiting veterans. His transformation from despair to purpose became a beacon for others arriving in their darkest moments. Summer brought an unexpected challenge. A documentary filmmaker, Rebecca Chen, no relation to Sarah, had been tracking stories of mysterious letter deliveries to military families. Her investigation led her dangerously close to the cabin's secret. Jake and Sarah faced a dilemma: reveal the truth and risk exposure, or let her continue investigating and potentially stumble upon it unprepared. They chose a middle path. They invited Rebecca to the cabin under the pretense of discussing veteran mental health programs. But Scout, ever the perfect judge of character, immediately trusted her, practically dragging her toward the hidden door. "Your dog seems to want to show me something," Rebecca said, curious but not suspicious. Jake and Sarah exchanged glances. The cabin, through Scout, had made the choice for them. They showed Rebecca the room, watching her journalist's skepticism battle with the undeniable evidence before her eyes. "This is the story of a lifetime," she breathed, camera in hand. "It's not a story," Jake said firmly. "It's a trust. The moment this becomes public, it becomes a circus. The government gets involved. Scientists want to study it. Religious groups claim it's either divine or demonic, and the veterans who need this place can't find peace here anymore." Rebecca struggled visibly with the conflict between her journalistic instincts and her human compassion. In the end, she chose compassion. She agreed to keep the secret, but asked to document it privately, creating a record for future generations of guardians. Her skills proved invaluable in organizing the vast archive of letters and journals, creating a digital preservation system that would outlast physical documents. The twins were born on a crisp October morning, arriving with the same punctuality Jake had always appreciated in military operations. James came first, then Jennifer 3 minutes later. Both healthy, both strong, both somehow already seeming wise beyond their minutes of age. When Jake brought them to the cabin for the first time, the impossible room responded. A new section appeared: Future Guardians. Inside were items that belonged to James and Jennifer's future. Military decorations not yet earned, letters not yet written, photographs of them as adults standing where Jake stood now. But there were others too. Photos of children Jake and Sarah didn't recognize, from families they hadn't met. The next generation of guardians wasn't just their biological children, but a community of inheritors who would share the responsibility. That Christmas, Jake initiated a new tradition. Every veteran who'd been helped by the cabin was invited to write a letter to future veterans, to be opened in times of crisis decades hence. The letters poured in, hundreds of them, each containing hard-won wisdom about survival, healing, and hope. General Hayes attended the Christmas gathering, bringing with her a gift that stunned everyone. She'd arranged for the cabin to be designated as a National Historic Site, but with unique provisions. No public access, no government oversight, funding provided through a special Veterans Fund, and guardianship remaining with the Morrison-Chen family in perpetuity. The cabin was protected forever, its secret safe within official secrecy. As Jake stood on the porch that Christmas Eve, holding his infant son while Sarah cradled Jennifer, surrounded by the extended family of veterans and helpers, he marveled at the journey. 2 years ago he'd been alone, broken, purposeless. Now he was a husband, father, guardian of something miraculous, and part of a community bound by service and sacrifice. Scout, showing his age now but still strong, sat beside him, looking out at the snow-covered forest with the satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. He'd brought Jake here, knowing somehow what would unfold. Bella lay nearby, watching over the twins with maternal instinct. "Do you think they'll understand?" Sarah asked, looking at their children. "The responsibility they're inheriting?" "When the time comes," Jake said, "the cabin will make sure of it, just like it did for us." Inside, the impossible room waited with its ever-growing collection of letters, connections, and futures. New wars would come, Jake knew. New veterans would return broken and lost. But the cabin would be here. The room would be waiting, and the guardians would continue their work. As midnight approached on another Christmas Eve, Jake heard something that made him smile. Footsteps in the snow, hesitant but determined. Another lost soul finding their way to sanctuary. He handed James to Sarah and went to open the door, ready to offer the same welcome he'd received 2 years ago. The figure at the door was young, barely out of basic training from the look of her. Army uniform, haunted eyes, a service dog at her side. "I'm sorry to intrude," she began. "I don't really know why I'm here. I was driving and got lost and saw your lights." "You're not lost," Jake said gently. "You're exactly where you need to be. Welcome to the cabin. I'm Jake. Come in and get warm. We've been expecting you." As he led her inside, introducing her to Sarah and the others, showing her to a room, promising that everything would make sense soon, Jake felt the deep satisfaction of purpose fulfilled. The cycle continued. The cabin endured. The letters found their homes. The broken found healing. And the impossible remained possible for those who needed it most. In the impossible room, a new letter appeared on the shelf, written by someone not yet born to someone who died long ago, proving once again that in this sacred space, time was just another boundary that love, service, and sacrifice could cross. The cabin stood strong against the winter night, a lighthouse in the forest, calling the lost home. And Jake Morrison, who'd once thought he had nothing left to give, found that he had everything needed: a guardian's heart, a healer's purpose, and a family bound not by blood alone, but by something stronger, the unbreakable bonds forged in service and renewed in salvation. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey with Jake and Scout. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of the connections that bind us all, or simply gave you hope during this holiday season, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support means everything and helps us continue bringing these amazing stories to life. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you'll be the first to know when our next story drops. And remember, sometimes the most impossible discoveries are the ones that show us we were never really alone. Until next time, hold your loved ones close. Reach out to someone who might be struggling and believe in the magic that connects us all.